HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Eastern Front, A History of the Great War, 1914 to 1918, by Nick Lloyd, read by Elliot Fitzpatrick. Note on the text. One of the first questions any historian of the Eastern Front must answer is the choice of which calendar to follow. Because two versions were in use, the Germans and Austrians kept to the Western Gregorian calendar, while the Russians relied upon the Julian, which was 13 days behind. Accounts often include both versions. For the sake of consistency, I've used the Gregorian calendar throughout, but when sources were originally recorded in their Julian form, I have added OS to denote Old Style. This means that the abdication of the Tsar and the Bolshevik Revolution occur in this book in March and November 1917, respectively, as opposed to February and October, which are found in most Russian histories. In February 1918, the Bolsheviks adopted the Gregorian calendar. Names of places and individuals can also appear differently across sources. Place names were often changed when new occupying powers moved in, so I have tended to use the most popular or recognizable forms. Preface. Writing in the 1920s, Winston Churchill believed that the First World War on the Eastern Front was incomparably the greatest war in history, in its scale, in its slaughter, in the exertions of the combatants, in its military kaleidoscope. It far surpasses by magnitude and intensity all similar human episodes. It was, he concluded, the most frightful misfortune to fall upon mankind since the collapse of the Roman Empire before the barbarians. This conflict, which pitched the central powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary against Imperial Russia, lies at the heart of the Great War. It was its mainspring and core which changed the political order of Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans forever. This book, the second volume in a trilogy, tells the story of the other First World War, where, as Churchill put it, the distant cannonade in France breaks only fitfully upon the ear. Despite the immensity of Churchill's frightful misfortune, the Eastern Front is much less familiar to English-language audiences than the war in the West. Only a few battles, notably the Russian defeat at Tannenberg in August 1914, are widely known, with most of the other major engagements and many of the key figures never receiving the attention lavished on either the war in France or the campaigns in the Middle East, both of which remain highly controversial to this day. For decades, the only notable study was Norman Stone's pioneering The Eastern Front, first published in 1975. Although an enormous amount of historical material has been produced since then, much of it remains known only to specialists, leaving our memory of the Eastern Front languishing in what the historian Sean McMeekan has called a deep freeze. Fortunately, in recent years, scholars have started to rediscover the military history of the war in the East, transforming our understanding of the First World War and helping to bring this forgotten front in from the cold. Looking again at the Eastern Front offers a useful corrective to the preponderance of the West in many narratives of the war. While the fighting in France and Belgium was infamous for its trench stalemate, it was a more traditional affair in the East, much closer to the kind of conflict that had been expected by contemporaries. Because the front line was at least twice as long as in France, sometimes stretching to over 900 miles, the suffocating density of forces found in the West could never be achieved, meaning that breakthroughs were always possible, and there continued to be space for cavalry charges and grand battles of maneuver throughout the war. But this did not mean that combat was any less bloody. Upwards of 2.3 million Russian soldiers were killed in their doomed struggle against the Central Powers. Their opponents, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, lost between 1.1 and 1.2 million men, only then to collapse in 1918, with the disintegration of both empires creating a human catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. The battlefields of the Eastern Front may have lacked the claustrophobia of France, but they witnessed a similar process of change and development in military skill and technology. The enormous power of modern rifles, machine guns, and quick-firing artillery rendered traditional battle tactics, bayonet charges, and close-order drill almost suicidal. The armies of all sides had no choice but to undergo a radical transformation that required greater firepower, placed more emphasis on looser skirmish lines when making advances, and sought out new weaponry wherever it could be found. The first use of a chemical agent in the war occurred in January 1915, when thousands of lacrimatory gas shells were fired off at the village of Bolimov in Russian Poland, a full 3 months before chlorine was used in Belgium. By 1916, the entire panoply of modern weaponry and tactics that had been pioneered in France, including extensive trench systems, creeping artillery barrages, poison gas and air power, could be found on the Eastern Front. It was at Riga in September 1917 that the first large-scale use of infiltration tactics occurred, proof of how important the Eastern Front was as a laboratory of war. Perhaps the most radical aspect of the struggle in the East was that violence was not confined to armies. In sharp contrast to the West, where brutality against civilians was, for the most part, restrained, the Eastern Front witnessed the large-scale abuse of civilian populations, particularly Jews. The inhabitants of those areas that were overrun by invading armies were routinely divided into reliable or unreliable ethnic groups and accused of spying or of sympathizing with the enemy. Those who were deemed problematic were rounded up and deported, their possessions looted or destroyed, and forced to undertake long and hazardous marches either into the Russian interior or back into the cities of the Habsburg Empire. This mass movement of people would bring the war to the home front in ways that were profoundly destabilizing, and it was no surprise that by as early as 1915, Russian moderates in Petrograd were complaining that the naked and hungry spread panic everywhere, dampening the last remnants of the enthusiasm which existed in the first months of the war, dragging Russia into the abyss, into revolution, and into destruction. This book deals with what might be termed the Greater Eastern Front, and includes the fighting in the Balkans, Italy, and Macedonia. Although these campaigns usually took a back seat to the drama unfolding in Poland and Galicia, at least until 1916, they should be understood as part of one great struggle that stretched from the Baltic to the Alps, from the peaks of the Carpathians to the shores of the Aegean. This account tries to combine these theatres of war into a single narrative, showing how the battlefields were linked together and how the success or failure of arms in one place would impact the others. The geographical span of the book may be larger than the first volume, but its themes are broadly similar. It concerns those men who fought the war at the strategic and operational levels, the politicians and generals who raised and commanded armies. As in the Western Front, I wanted to present the war as it appeared to those at the highest echelons of command and leadership, to show how they tried, and often failed, to achieve their goals, and to leave any judgment to the listener. The story that follows is based upon the letters, diary entries, and reports written by these men as they passed through 4 years of terrible carnage. Historical accounts, biographies, and collections of documents were central to the construction of my narrative, which draws from Austrian, German, Russian, Serbian, Italian, Romanian, Bulgarian, and French sources, many of which have been translated for the first time. Understanding Russia's war, how she fought and subsequently collapsed, was perhaps the most challenging part. Central to the story, yet curiously obscure. Historical attention has, perhaps understandably, tended to focus more on the revolution of 1917 than on the war that led up to it, which has left significant gaps in our understanding. Norman Stone's The Eastern Front was an essential guide, complemented by more recent research, including David Stone's The Russian Army in the Great War, The Eastern Front, 1914 to 1917, Paul Robinson's Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, Supreme Commander of the Russian Army, and Oleg Irepetov's 4 volumes on the Russian Empire at War, published between 2014 and 2015 and richly deserving of an English translation. Several weighty collections of documents on Russian operations, compiled by the Red Army during the 1930s, were also useful in uncovering the story of the Tsar's forces between 1914 and 1916, and giving their generals, too often downplayed or ignored entirely, an authentic voice. For the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it is impossible to overlook Manfred Raukensteiner's The First World War and the End of the Habsburg Monarchy, originally written in 1993 and recently translated into English, which offers the most complete guide to the final years of the empire. Lawrence Sundhaus's Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, Architect of the Apocalypse, also provided a fair and reliable assessment of one of the most important, yet least understood soldiers of the war. A special mention should go to the American historian Stan Hanna, who has single-handedly translated almost the entire 7-volume Habsburg official history, Österreich-Ungarns letzter Krieg, Austria-Hungary's Last War, into English. While the translations used in this account are my own, Hanna's achievement in making such an important source readily available to a wider audience deserves enormous respect. When looking to the other fronts, several studies were also invaluable, including John Gooch's The Italian Army and the First World War, David Dutton's The Politics of Diplomacy, Britain and France in the Balkans in the First World War, James Lyon's Serbia and the Balkan Front, 1914, The Outbreak of the Great War, and Glenn Torrey's extensive work on the Romanian campaign. The Eastern Front has simultaneously been the hardest and most interesting book I have written, and I hope listeners who followed the travails of Generals Foch, Pétain, Haig and Pershing in France, and Flanders in the first volume, will be intrigued to hear about what was happening elsewhere in the war. The battles that were hitherto only mentioned briefly or in passing can now be experienced in much more detail. It is a story of great tragedy and horror, cruelty and pain, as all wars are, but also of incredible courage and resilience that echoes down to our time. This book was completed under the shadow of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there was a sense of weary familiarity as news bulletins brought details of the fighting and shelling around Kyiv and Donetsk, Lviv and Mariupol. The weight of history still hangs over these lands, but perhaps the deep freeze is now finally beginning to thaw and allow us to glimpse the Eastern Front in new and better ways. This book is dedicated to my youngest daughter Isabel, who brings such joy to my family. I hope that one day she reads it. N.L. Cheltenham, England, 2023. Prologue. It is nothing. Mortally wounded, the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie lay slumped on the back seat of their car, a 1911 Graf van Stift convertible, as they were driven back to the Konark, the governor's residence in Sarajevo. It was Sunday, 28th of June 1914, and the royal visit to Bosnia had ended in disaster. Franz Ferdinand had been shot in the neck at close range, his blood spraying onto the face of his driver, while a second shot had pierced Sophie's abdomen. Major von Huttenbrenner, the senior medical officer in the official party, attended to the royal couple as soon as they had been carried to safety. Sophie was already dead, her body limp, and her white silk dress stained with a dark, seeping patch of blood. The Archduke was unconscious, his breathing shallow, with blood trickling from his neck and mouth. Count Morsi, his long-serving valet, cut open Franz Ferdinand's blue tunic to ease his chest, but it did no good. Within a matter of minutes, shortly after 11 o'clock that morning, he was dead. The murderer was a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, Gavrilo Princip. A sickly, thin-faced youth, Princip was a member of a secret militant organization, Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, Union or Death, sometimes known as the Black Hand, which was sworn to fight for a greater Serbia. After being smuggled across the border with 6 other conspirators, he was given a pistol and a bomb and told to position himself along the route that the Archduke would travel and strike if an opportunity presented itself. The plot had been orchestrated from Belgrade by the head of Serbian military intelligence, Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijević. When Dimitrijević heard about the royal visit to Bosnia, he was insistent that Franz Ferdinand must die. Not only was the Archduke the heir to the imperial throne, he was also a moderate and a reformer whose stated desire to create a new kind of federal empire would have rendered the possibility of a greater Serbia far more unlikely. Franz Ferdinand believed that rising political tensions within Vienna's sprawling empire could only be dampened by more reform, by spreading power downwards. This meant revisiting the terms of the Ausgleich of 1867, which had created the dual monarchy of Austria and Hungary, and turning it into a trialist structure with the addition of a South Slav kingdom, a move that might fatally weaken the appeal of an enlarged Serbia. As Princip later revealed, he would have prevented, as a future ruler, our union by realizing certain reforms which would evidently have been against our interests. This was why Franz Ferdinand had to die. After spending 2 days out on maneuvers in the hills surrounding Sarajevo, Franz Ferdinand had been on his way to a reception with local dignitaries at the city hall. The first attack came as his car was passing the Chumaria Bridge, which lay along the Apple Quay, a pleasant street running beside the Miljatska River through the center of the city, about 650 yards from his destination. A tall young man in a long black coat, a Bosnian Serb called Nedjeliko Chabrinovic, saw the car, lit the fuse on his bomb, and hurled it. Franz Ferdinand's driver immediately spotted the assailant and slammed his foot down on the accelerator, which meant that the bomb bounced off the back hood of the car, hit the pavement, and rolled under the following vehicle, detonating with a sickening explosion. Although the royal couple were unharmed, 2 attendants were wounded, cut by shrapnel, and their vehicle was wrecked. Chabrinovic had jumped over the wall down onto the riverbed, which had sunk to a trickle in the summer months, and was chased by police officers, who seized him shortly afterwards, the bomb thrower coughing and spluttering after taking a cyanide pill, which seared his throat, but did not kill him. Within minutes, the motorcade had reached the city hall, where the royal party were ushered inside. Clutching his speaker's notes, now spattered with blood, Franz Ferdinand gave a short address before meeting with officials, including the governor of Bosnia, General Oskar Potiorek, who was responsible for the royal family's security. The Archduke wanted to visit the wounded attendants, who were being ferried to the garrison hospital, so it was agreed that he would return by a new, quicker route straight down the Apple Quay, instead of following the original plan, which would have had the motorcade turning right at the Latin Bridge down the narrow Franz Josef Street. Unfortunately, no one seemed to have told the Archduke's driver, so instead of continuing along the main road, he followed the original route, slowing down and then turning right past the Moritz Schiller Spice Emporium. As he did so, Potiorek realized the mistake and turned to him. "What is this? Stop! You are going the wrong way. We ought to go via Apple Quay." The Archduke's car was only motionless for a few precious moments, but it was enough for Princip to earn his place in the pantheon of Serbian national heroes. After Chabrinovich's bomb attack, Princip had drifted through the crowds, assuming that the assassination attempt had failed, and ended up in Franz Josef Street. Suddenly, realizing that his target was now right in front of him, he acted without thinking, raising his pistol and firing 2 shots at point-blank range. For a split second, there was only a stunned stillness, broken by the sound of the shots echoing off the street walls. Then Princip was seized by the Archduke's bodyguards and hurled to the ground. Count Franz Harrach, who had been standing on the left-hand side of the car, on the running board, noticed how Sophie had sunk down in her seat, and Franz Ferdinand now began to dip forward, causing Harrach to ask whether His Highness was in great pain. His face was slightly distorted, and he repeated 6 or 7 times, every time losing more consciousness and with a fading voice, "It is nothing." Then the Archduke was silent, the only sound being a convulsive rattle in his throat, caused by blood loss. This ceased on arrival at the governor's residence. The 2 unconscious bodies were carried into the building, where their death was soon established. Austria-Hungary would react, but how exactly remained to be decided. While spontaneous anti-Serb pogroms broke out across the empire, the government was quickly recalled in Vienna. Austrian Prime Minister Karl Sturck, Chief of the General Staff Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, Foreign Minister Count Leopold von Berchtold, and his deputy Count Alexander Hoyos were all convinced that Austria had to take a strong line, using the opportunity to strike down her foremost opponent in the Balkans. The only note of caution came from the Hungarian Prime Minister Count István Tisza. "We have no sufficient grounds for holding Serbia responsible," he told Emperor Franz Josef several days after the shooting. "Forcing matters would be a fatal mistake, for we should appear before the world as the disturber of the peace and would kindle the fires of a great war in the most unfavorable conditions." Germany's position would be crucial. Despite fighting each other in 1866, the Austrian and Prussian, now German, empires had drawn closer over subsequent decades. They were now part of the Triple Alliance, comprising Austria, Germany, and Italy, which was originally signed in May 1882. This, essentially conservative and defensive alliance committed the signatories to mutual peace and friendship, and promised that none would enter into an alliance or engagement directed against any one of their states. Moreover, were France to attack Italy, Germany and Austria would be bound to lend help and assistance with all their forces. Although Italy was decidedly nervous about taking part in a war in defense of Habsburg interests in the Balkans and would remain neutral in July 1914, Germany had declared privately that Austria had her full support. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II regarded the assassination as an act that could not go unpunished and told his officials that it was high time that a clean sweep was made of the Serbs. What is more, when Vienna's envoy, Count Hoyos, arrived in Berlin on the 5th of July, he was told that Germany would support Austria, even in the event of a war with Russia, a prospect that did not strike the Kaiser as being particularly likely. Germany's declaration of unconditional support hardened the hearts of those in Vienna who pushed for a decisive confrontation with Belgrade. Although the Kaiser was under the impression that Austria was preparing for an immediate attack, it took weeks before she was ready. Habsburg troops from rural areas were traditionally allowed to go home during the summer months for the harvest, and with large sections of the army not due to return until the 25th of July, significant military action before that date was impossible. A council of war was held on the 7th of July, at which the Habsburg ministers repeated their demands for a firm stance. Any diplomatic maneuvers should happen with a firm intention of concluding the whole affair with war. Moreover, far-reaching demands should be made to Serbia, acceptance of which must be regarded as out of the question, so that a radical solution by means of military intervention can be set in motion. Tisza again set out his objections, and insisted that there must be an opportunity for Serbia to avoid hostilities. The following day, still deeply troubled at the pace of events, he wrote to Franz Josef and warned him that a war with Serbia would, in all conscience, provoke Russian intervention and thus world war. Tisza's refusal to be pushed into a war in the Balkans was now the chief stumbling block to Austrian action. Count Berchtold was a firm believer in a military solution and kept up the pressure on the Hungarian Premier throughout the following week, assuring him of German support and muttering darkly about the disastrous consequences of disappointing the Kaiser. A week later, on the 14th of July, another council took place, and Tisza finally gave way, agreeing that an ultimatum be sent to Belgrade after he was presented with the military difficulties that might arise should action be delayed any further. Tisza had reluctantly dropped his objections, but only on the understanding that apart from making some small regulations of the border, Austria would not annex Serbia, thus avoiding adding more disgruntled Slavs to the empire. The text of the note to be sent to Belgrade, as it was settled today, Berchtold reported to Franz Josef, is such that we must reckon with the probability of war. The Serbs would have just 48 hours to respond. After being drafted and redrafted numerous times, the ultimatum was delivered by Baron Vladimir von Giesel, minister to Serbia, on the 23rd of July. Preliminary investigations had revealed that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand had been planned in Belgrade, with the weapons and explosives supplied by Serbian officers belonging to the Narodna Odbrana, National Defense, a nationalist organization with links to Ujedinjenje ili Smrt. Therefore, Vienna demanded Serbia issue a proclamation condemning the propaganda directed against Austria-Hungary, regretting the involvement of Serbian officers and functionaries in this propaganda, and warning that the royal Serbian government should proceed with the utmost rigor against persons who may be guilty of such machinations. 10 further demands were made, including the suppression of any publication that incited hatred and contempt against the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the immediate dissolution of the Narodna Odbrana, and the acceptance of Austrian representatives into Serbia to help suppress the subversive movement directed against the territorial integrity of the monarchy. The Serbian response was initially one of bewilderment. The Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic, was not in Belgrade, but out at Niš in the south, campaigning for re-election, leaving one of his ministers, Dr. Lazar Paciu, in charge. When Pasic was found, he immediately returned to the capital and summoned his ministers. According to Paciu, the demands were such that no Serbian government could agree to them, being inconsistent with the country's sovereignty and honour, a view echoed by Serbia's ruling monarch, Crown Prince Alexander, who sent an urgent message to the Russian Tsar Nicholas II. Austrian demands were unnecessarily humiliating and incompatible with her dignity as an independent state. With only hours to go before the deadline, Alexander begged the Tsar to help. "The much appreciated goodwill which your Majesty has so often..."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?